There's something about your work where you've also studied comparative race relations.
Yes,
And I'm
yes.
curious about just kind of the Cuban Revolution is something that has failed economically. There's all the civil liberties concerns, but they also rather famously declared that racism had been defeated.
And been
And that
eradicated,
seems
yes.
to have been somewhat overstated. What do you imagine or what is it that you draw out of the experience of the Cuban people with respect to race relations that perhaps can inform our sensibilities here in this country?
Well, I mean, I think putting the revolution aside, because the issue of race in Cuba is understood, lived differently than in the United States, right? And so you can't really go into Cuba with our very peculiar, even demented understanding of race and apply it to Cuba, right?
Okay.
It would be like someone with the disease saying, we can see the light and you should see it like we do, right?
Okay.
Right? So I teach a class called Comparative Race and Ethnic Relations, and we look at the United States vis-a-vis mainly Latin America, but we also look at, South Africa, and we look at, Israel, and we look at different kind of like regimes of race and ethnic relations, right? And in Cuba, you have a history, right, where people are Cuban first, and race isn't so much race as color, right? And this is not to say that there's not racism. I always tell my students, it's not that there's not racism, there's just different form of racism. And it has to do with, in the United States, we established a color line. In Cuba, they established a gradation or color lines, right, in terms of colorism. And so there's this really peculiar, and to our minds, racist, right, idea that you can be whiter or blacker instead of just white and black, right? So there's not just these two groups. And there's a lot more mixture within families. And so the very idea of that is different.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the revolution came along and did, at least briefly, racism and being a racist was counter-revolutionary. And there were a number of early statements focusing on eradicating racism. But there was maybe two big problems with the kind of way they implemented that, in my opinion, in my take, right? One, or maybe three. One is that all of the solutions and all of the policies were top-down governmentally induced and policies, right?
Mm-hmm.
They didn't rely on civil society and activist groups, organizations to independently do that, right? So there were any groups like the NAACP or any other, Afro-centric cultural or political groups were outlawed at the beginning of the revolution. And there was a long history of them, right? So it wasn't allowing agency to Afro-Cubans or groups to fight for their own liberation or freedom or against racism. It was a government policy, right? So that's, I think, problematic from a kind of democratic civil society point of view, right? And an agency point of view, right? The second thing that happened in Cuba was that once they declared that racism was abolished, it was counter-revolutionary to talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
Weird how that
right?
happens.
So it was very Orwellian. It's like, you're a racist for mentioning race because we've already solved that problem, and you're dividing us. And you're fueling the fire of these people who are Afro-Cuban or not, right? And we're all Cuban, right? We're all revolutionary here, right? And then the final thing that they did was a very socialist thing, which was to say the big problem in the world is class.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're going to eradicate class hierarchy and class privilege and the class struggle, or through the class struggle, and that will take care of racism. And for a number of years, that worked in the sense that, that rising tide, class-wise, raised the standard of living of Afro-Cubans significantly. But then that ran out of gas after about 20 years. And then, of course, the Soviet Union's largesse ran out. And so in the early 1990s, you see this kind of revanchist return of bald racism interpersonal racism, but also racism that was revealed through the entry of capitalism and the way that then jobs were kind of coded for whites and off limits to blacks in terms of the new tourism industry. Blacks who didn't have relatives abroad, because mostly it was whites who went abroad, who went to exile, weren't getting remittances, and therefore there was a new class division that broke down along racial lines in Cuba, because whites were much more likely to get money from Miami. Mm-hmm. And if you get $100 a month,
that's huge. It's 10 times your salary.
10 times your salary, and your neighbor who's black doesn't get anything because his or her relatives didn't go to Miami, right? Then that's a problem. And then also Afro-Cubans, because they were generally dealt out of that, right? They were more likely to be hustling, and they're no more likely to be stopped by an Afro-Cuban police officer in the street and check to see if you have a record or hassle or harassed or whatever, right? So that's been the case maybe for the last 30, 35 years. That new you could call it new or old racism coming back. Also, the revolution leveled things in Cuba class-wise, but people who had properties were able to keep their properties. They just had to, give up their, maybe their beach house or whatever, right? And so what has happened in the 90s is that people now, the private sector that has arisen in Cuba has arisen based on, and people don't have assets, right? So they can't buy or rent a storefront and start a business. So they almost always start their businesses in their homes. And white Cubans are much more likely to have large, centrally located homes where they can set up a restaurant, where they can set up an Airbnb, or they can, set up a business. And Afro-Cubans generally don't have, they haven't inherited those things from the pre-revolutionary years. And so there's all of these complex things that makes race a real thing, even though Cubans in some ways are much more advanced than we North Americans, because it's not the first thing they generally see, right? It's not invisible, but it's not the defining feature. Mirta Ojito, who used to work, she's a Cuban American who came in the Mariel boat lift, and she wrote this fabulous book called Finding Mañana. It's a memoir about her coming to the United States in a ship, and the Mariel boat lift the ship was called Mañana, right? And she's trying to find the ship many years later, right? Anyway, she worked for the New York Times as a journalist, and she wrote this fabulous piece that looked at these two best friends who grew up in Cuba. One was white and one was black. And they were best friends, and they were Cuban. And one happened to be white and one happened to be black. And part of that was that they were kind of like equally disadvantaged, equally poor, and maybe equally happy or unhappy. But they both then moved to Miami. And within 2 or 3 years, they were like strangers, because one of them assimilated to black Miami and the other assimilated to white Miami. And they assimilated into a world where your race came first, not your nationality was not mentioned.
This was a common theme of Cuban baseball players who came to America in the late 50s and especially the early 60s. A lot of them, Cuba is an incredible font of baseball talent, and a lot of them came and sort of stayed after the revolution because private baseball was going away, professional baseball was going away, and then there was chaos in the revolution, so they stayed here. I interviewed a guy, actually, Julio Becerra.
Can I graduate to this?
Of course, yes. It's there for you. Come on now.
Our ice is melting,
Yeah,
okay.
Use it while you can. And they were just befuddled. They're like, you Americans, all you're talking about is race. It's crazy. And still the early 60s, so there was actual segregation in spring training in Florida and places like that. But I heard this a lot also, like on the streets of Havana. And it also became a whataboutism from the Castro regime, which was, you're criticizing our human rights, but like, look at your horrible racism in America. Like I remember going to, I saw Malcolm X in Cuba. It was
the film, not the person.
The film, not the person.
Wait a second, you had to go there back in.
They just like stole it and played it in some little theater, and there was a photographic display about like, how racist New York was, either in the lobby or in a museum close by. And it was just black and white pictures of like poor black people in New York. And it was like, see, the revolution's better than this.
It's fascinating.
No, it's all jumbled up, but like it's a Sherman-Williams thing. It's like it doesn't make sense really to talk about. I mean, maybe you have a different view of like black and white as fixed categories in Cuba. I mean, the one that everyone wants to be is mulatto, which is a word that they use all the time. It's a little bit awkward at first, but like it's a word. And yeah, it feels different. It's similar in a similar way that I found in Israel, to my surprise too. Just like the racial classifications that we bring over there, like, no, that's not exactly
for us. It's more essential. It's more, there's a deeper belief. And I think that this is true of people on the left and the right, both the people who have these aspirations to kind of create not even post-racial, post-white supremacy America, where we've kind of taken care of all of the historic awfulness of racism in America, and the people who are race realists. I think they both ultimately believe in something that is nearly biological about race. It's inescapable. You are immutably black. You are black in this kind of fundamental way, or white in this fundamental way that's inescapable. And we have to address things along that matrix or axis.
And that's a disease.
Yeah.
That's a mental disease that we're socialized in from a young age, and it blinds us. And that's why travel is so amazing, because you suddenly like discover a different reality. You've been looking through these, Coke bottle glasses your whole life, and you take them off, and you're like, oh, you're a human being.
Yeah.
You're not a black human being, or a white, or a green, or whatever, Chinese, or whatever, right? I always tell my students, I say, we have this thing, and luckily people don't use the term anymore, called the one drop rule. And luckily,
and the brown paper bag test as well.
Right. And people.
What's the brown paper bag test?
If you're darker than a brown paper bag, then you're black.
Shit.
Yeah.
Oh, shit.
Well, and that was actually used by blacks themselves because they wanted to filter out the darker brothers and sisters from their social clubs. Right. Oh. Yeah. One of the most horrible things, along with racism, is racism by a group against itself. Right. Against people who are part of that same group, right? I always say that we have a one-drop rule. One drop of black blood makes you black, right? So Barack Obama is black, right?
Tiger Woods,
et cetera, right?
Well, Tiger Woods and Barack Obama had different personal approaches to those particular rules, which we can come to in a moment.
They did. No, and that's why I say that the one-drop rule has weakened, because people like that can redefine themselves.
Tiger.
And it can stick to some degree, right?
He's got other problems.
Yeah. like Jeter, right, or et cetera, right? Like they didn't have to fit into those categories, but they would have in the past, right? It would have been no choice of theirs. It would have been the society would have chose it for them. But then I say, well, in Latin America and in Cuba, in this case, right, one drop of white blood doesn't make you white, but it makes you not black. Because what they do is that they have a racist system, but they measure it from the bottom up instead of the top down. So that one drop of white blood improves you so that you're no longer black, because only pure blacks are black. So that's the way that Cubans and Brazilians and Puerto Ricans and Dominicans are racist, right? Because they do that. Right? Whereas we do the opposite, where we think of whiteness as pure, and then any contamination of that makes you non-white or black, right, in this case. And so that's why I say, the race thing is fascinating, because we just have different chips in our brains. And therefore, even if we see the same thing, we understand it differently.
Well, I think Americans imagine themselves as enlightened because they've gotten past using things like octoroon and quadroon and mulatto, et cetera. And we're just like black and white, as if that is more sophisticated.
Yeah.
And no, it's actually all of the same ridiculousness. The kaleidoscope of categories is kind of insane too, and it's ridiculous to be tracking all of that. But yes, it is closer to the truth, which is that people are singular. And it's funny that even in our conversation here, the reality is that most race conversation tends to be mediated through the lens of these groups. So you can have in-group racism, but the groups themselves are manufactured it is all artificial, like all the way down the line, to the point where you have Barack Obama, who was